session. My name is Emma Parker. I am the Artistic Director for Center for Arts Inspired Learning, and we are the hosts for this discussion today. Just to give everyone a little bit of background, this is a breakout session that was based upon a panel discussion presented 2 weeks ago around trauma during, before, and after COVID-19. In speaking to several participants and answering some of the questions and also receiving more questions, we found that the breakout sessions needed to go into a deeper dive into how we can connect to the youth. This is a focus on how educators, artists, people working with the pre-K to 12th grade students can better connect when we are back in full programming with them or in full educational systems with them. We wanted to dive deeper in a response to what has also been happening in the racial inequities recently. So today's topic will touch upon racial trauma during the COVID pandemic and how we can better respond and have the background and basis knowledge of what that means for our youth, what that means for ourselves. So today, your two presenters are Erica Johnson from CASE and Charlotte Kennerly. She is from the CMSD or Cleveland Metropolitan School District. And I'm gonna let them introduce themselves a little bit further and kind of take over. But some logistics to go over are that we are recording. You can be on screen or off screen, but the recording will only showcase my screen. If you have current thoughts, questions, concerns, please put those in the chat box. They will be sent directly to myself, and myself and the presenters will answer those at the end of the session. So as things come up, feel free to put them in the chat box or jot them down. I will unmute all participants at the end of the session for questions or a discussion. We want this to be an open discussion with the group, so make sure to, if you have any thoughts or questions, please let us know. All right, I'm gonna turn it over to Charlotte and Erica.
Hi everyone, my name is Charlotte Kennerly. I work for Cleveland Metropolitan Schools. I am intervention specialist for early childhood, but my current position is part of the preschool assessment clinic. So I work part of a team determining if children have unique needs and then how to support those unique needs. I am also a member of Milestones Diversity Task Force, and I also hold a school counseling certification.
Hello, my name is Erica Johnson. I'm a doctoral student at Case Western in the Organizational Behavior Program, Weatherhead School of Management. I'm also a licensed clinical social worker as well. And I used to work in human resources, organizational development. So I'm merging both together, and I'm studying employees with trauma history, specifically marginalized employees like Blacks and Latins, and how organizations, workplaces can either mitigate or exacerbate any type of trauma responses. And so I've been looking more so at racial trauma, exposure, community violence as well.
Okay, so I am going to start first. I hope everyone is cool and everything is going well. I have a quote from Grace Lee Boggs. So I'd like everyone to kind of center themselves and think about this. Every crisis, actual or impending, needs to be viewed as an opportunity to bring about profound changes in our society. Going beyond protest organizing, visionary organizing begins by creating images and stories of the future that help us imagine and create alternatives to the existing system. So I'm gonna go right now into the ACEs, so like a deeper dive into ACEs, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. So it was a study conducted by Kaiser Permanente along with the CDC in 1995 through 1997 in California. And the study demonstrated the correlation between that trauma health and social problems across a lifespan. There are three main categories. Can you switch the slide? Which are abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, and under abuse is physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. Under neglect is physical and emotional and household dysfunction, mental illness, mother treated violently, divorce, incarcerated relative, or substance abuse. So the findings, some of the key findings in California was 61% of adults have experienced at least one ACE, 1 in 6 or 16% had experienced 4 or more, and the most common ACE was emotional abuse, like verbal abuse. And so parental separation, 26%, substance abuse, 26 also, physical abuse was 18, witnessing domestic violence was 17, and 15% for the mental illness, 11 for sexual abuse, and 9 for neglect, and 6 for incarcerated household members. So we're gonna listen to Nadine Burke. She was part of the study, and she does a really good job of explaining it and explaining it what it means. It's, you know, I think you can take away what it means in the classroom and what it's going to mean sometimes what's going on in communities. So we're going to watch this for a little while.
Oh.
In the mid-90s, the CDC and Kaiser Permanente discovered an exposure that dramatically increased the risk for 7 out of 10 of the leading causes of death in the United States. In high doses, it affects brain development, the immune system, hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. Folks who are exposed in very high doses have triple the lifetime risk of heart disease and lung cancer, and a 20-year difference in life expectancy. And yet doctors today are not trained in routine screening or treatment. Now, the exposure I'm talking about is not a pesticide or a packaging chemical. It's childhood trauma. Okay, what kind of trauma am I talking about here? I'm not talking about failing a test or losing a basketball game. I am talking about threats that are so severe or pervasive that they literally get under our skin and change our physiology. Things like abuse or neglect, or growing up with a parent who struggles with mental illness or substance dependence. Now, for a long time, I viewed these things in the way I was trained to view them, either as a social problem, refer to social services, or as a mental health problem, refer to mental health services. And then something happened to make me rethink my entire approach. When I finished my residency, I wanted to go someplace where I felt really needed, someplace where I could make a difference. So I came to work for California Pacific Medical Center, one of the best private hospitals in Northern California. And together, we opened a clinic in Bayview, Hunters Point, one of the poorest, most underserved neighborhoods in San Francisco. Now, prior to that point, there had been only one pediatrician in all of Bayview to serve more than 10,000 children. So we hung a shingle, and we were able to provide top quality care regardless of ability to pay. It was so cool. We targeted the typical health disparities: access to care, immunization rates, asthma hospitalization rates, and we hit all of our numbers. We felt very proud of ourselves. But then I started noticing a disturbing trend. A lot of kids were being referred to me for ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But when I actually did a thorough history and physical, what I found was that for most of my patients, I couldn't make a diagnosis of ADHD. Most of the kids I was seeing had experienced such severe trauma that it felt like something else was going on. Somehow, I was missing something important. Now, before I did my residency, I did a master's degree in public health. And one of the things that they teach you in public health school is that if you're a doctor and you see 100 kids that all drink from the same well, and 98 of them develop diarrhea, you can go ahead and write that prescription for dose after dose after dose of antibiotics, or you can walk over and say, what the hell is in this well? So I began reading everything that I could get my hands on about how exposure to adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. And then one day, my colleague walked into my office and he said, Dr. Burke, have you seen this? In his hand was a copy of a research study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. That day changed my clinical practice and ultimately my career. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study is something that everybody needs to know about. It was done by Dr. Vince Felitti at Kaiser and Dr. Bob Onda at the CDC, and together they asked 17,500 adults about their history of exposure to what they called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. Those include physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, parental mental illness, substance dependence, incarceration, parental separation or divorce, or domestic violence. For every yes, you would get a point on your ACE score. And then what they did was they correlated these ACE scores against health outcomes. What they found was striking. Two things. Number one, ACEs are incredibly common. 67% of the population had at least one ACE, and 12.6%, 1 in 8, had 4 or more ACEs. The second thing that they found was that there was a dose-response relationship between ACEs and health outcomes. The higher your ACE score, the worse your health outcomes. For a person with an ACE score of 4 or more, their relative risk of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease was 2.5 times that of someone with an ACE score of 0. For hepatitis, it was also 2.5 times. For depression, it was 4.5 times. For suicidality, it was 12 times. A person with an ACE score of 7 or more had triple the lifetime risk of lung cancer and 3.5 times the risk of ischemic heart disease, the #1 killer in the United States of America. Well, of course, this makes sense. You know, some people looked at this data and they said, come on, you know, you have a rough childhood, you're more likely to drink and smoke and do all these things that are going to ruin your health. This isn't science. This is just bad behavior. It turns out this is exactly where the science comes in. We now understand better than we ever have before how exposure to early adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. It affects areas like the nucleus accumbens, the pleasure and reward center of the brain that is implicated in substance dependence. It inhibits the prefrontal cortex, which is necessary for impulse control and executive function, a critical area for learning. And on MRI scans, we see measurable differences in the amygdala, the brain's fear response center. So there are real neurologic reasons why folks exposed to high doses of adversity are more likely to engage in high-risk behavior. And that's important to know. But it turns out that even if you don't engage in any high-risk behavior, you're still more likely to develop heart disease or cancer. The reason for this has to do with the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the brain's and body's stress response system that governs our fight or flight response. How does it work? Well, imagine you're walking in the forest and you see a bear. Immediately, your hypothalamus sends a signal to your pituitary, which sends a signal to your adrenal gland that says, release stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol. And so your heart starts to pound, your pupils dilate, your airways open up, and you are ready to either fight that bear or run from the bear. And that is wonderful if you're in a forest and there's a bear. But the problem is what happens when the bear comes home every night. And this system is activated over and over and over again. And it goes from being adaptive or life-saving to maladaptive or health-damaging. Children are especially sensitive to this repeated stress activation because their brains and bodies are just developing. High doses of adversity not only affect brain structure and function, they affect the developing immune system, developing
You
hormonal
can
system,
stop now.
and even the way our DNA is.
And so with ACEs, it also extends into racial trauma. So for example, there's a group called Philadelphia Project that did expanded ACEs, and it looked at childhood trauma outside of the household. Because Kaiser Permanente CDC, in their study, it was more so household abuse, neglect, challenges. And so it showed that a majority of white respondents had higher ACEs. But when the Philadelphia Project actually did an expanded ACEs study looking at bullying, discrimination, exposure to community violence, racial discrimination, it showed that Blacks and Latinos actually had higher instances of childhood trauma. And so, of course, one of the main inquiries into trauma in general is looking into race-based or racial trauma. And so Carter, 2007, a researcher, back in 1997, created this race-based traumatic stress injury model. And so it shows how racial discrimination, everyday slights, actually mimics PTSD symptoms. And so the author categorized racial trauma discrimination into 3 categories. So the first one is racial discrimination, where it's more avoidant, so excluding marginalized people of color from different activities or from societal structures in general. Then there's racial harassment, which is more overt, hostile, physical, verbal attacks. And then there's discriminatory harassment, which is more hostility once a person of color reaches a certain level. So say at work, a Black or Latin person gets promoted and the white dominant workplace doesn't think that they deserve it, then they may act out on them in everyday specific ways. And so reactions to those everyday slights could turn into PTSD symptoms such as intrusion of the unwanted memories of the experience, avoidance of that specific coworker or different workplaces in general, or thoughts, feelings, memories, hyperarousal, so being irritable, hypervigilant, defensive over continuing stressors. And then negative mood. So usually in racial trauma, negative mood is seen as more like low self-worth and depression. And so Carter found that within individuals who experience race-based trauma, they actually had more negative impact when they had more one-on-one individual encounters with racial discrimination, and if they were everyday subtle instances of the racial discrimination, because there's the systemic structural where like people of color may not be able to get business loans and housings and so on, which is very endemic in the US culture. And then there's the one-on-one. And so that's something that needs to be looked into more in the DSM-5 and diagnosing PTSD. You go to the next slide. I wonder where the other side is. Oh, so this is just showing more of the racial microaggressions that could happen in everyday life. So instead of the overt harassments, these are the everyday little slights that more of the dominant culture can do. Especially this has been found in the workplace and in school systems. Those are the two dominant areas where microaggressions occur. So micro insults, I've seen this plenty of times when I worked in human resources on like recruiting sessions. So of course, in a lot of companies I would work for, we would have, you know, diversity recruiting, you know, to get our leadership more diverse. But then someone in the room, usually a white person, would say, oh, well, why aren't we going to hire the most qualified person? And I was like, what makes you think that just because we want diversity means the person isn't qualified? So that's a micro insult, insinuating that just because the person is a person of color, they're not as qualified as a white person. Or the ascription of intelligence, like, oh, you sure are articulate. Like maybe they think an Asian person, Hispanic, Black, aren't able to communicate well. And then micro assaults is the verbal, hostile attacks or physical attacks, which is more overt and conscious. And then micro invalidation, which is seen a lot, when people say, oh, I don't see color, or I don't care if you're green, red, yellow, etc. So it invalidates the person of color's experience because they're telling you about a traumatic event from being their race or ethnicity, but then you're invalidating it by saying, oh, well, I don't see color, so how does your situation exist? And so those are just some few examples of everyday slights. Next slide. So this goes further into the PTSD symptoms. So a racist event happens, which is appraised as traumatic. So trauma is negative, uncontrollable, and unexpected. And so when a racial discriminated event happens, like the person is caught off guard and they may not know how to respond as they normally think they would. So then they're shocked, disbelief, and then they may feel shame or guilt that they even allowed that to happen to them because it was such a sudden experience that they were caught off guard. They might have been in the fight or flight mode. So then it will transpire into the cluster of symptoms of PTSD, such as re-experiencing, which is the intrusion of the event or feelings or thoughts, avoidance, which is actually more common. So researcher Breyer found that in racial trauma, more avoidance occurs versus intrusion. So when more avoidance occurs, that actually leads to more negative outcomes. So then the negative mood and cognitions comes from feelings of low self-worth. A study of Black women found that when they were exposed to a racially traumatic event, they actually had more feelings of low self-worth, low self-esteem, especially if they practiced the avoidant behaviors. And then the physiological arousal is often seen in heightened irritability, hypervigilance, anger, because you're practicing for that next stressor to occur and you're constantly rehearsing it. That's something that's common in racial trauma, because if you experienced it before and maybe you didn't react in the way you thought you would have, then the next time you are definitely going to do that. So you're heightened, like you're ready to attack in the next event. Next slide. So these are other unhealthy racial trauma outcomes. So depression is seen a lot. Anxiety, hypertension, low self-esteem. And it actually found, O'Keefe, the researcher cited below, found that microaggressions was actually more debilitating. And Breyer, researcher, found that it's actually intergenerational. So victims of trauma who experienced PTSD symptoms actually had higher glucocorticoid in their body. And so that actually impacted their immune system, which led to asthma, allergies, heart disease, immune deficiencies, like gastrointestinal disorders, and it carried on to their children. And so that's why racial trauma is intergenerational, and it's prevalent within communities of color. Next slide. And so another researcher, Margaret Spencer at University of Chicago, created the phenomenological variant of ecological systems theory, which is a variant of Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory that found that, it's the person and environment. So how a child ends up creating their identity and coping first stems from the risk contributors. So what is their net vulnerability? Were they born into a society that actually has communication that their racial ethnic group is less than? So that's already a vulnerability they came into the world with. It can have to do with gender, socioeconomic status, and so on. So then level 2, what is the stress engagement? Is there exposure to community violence? Is the child facing discrimination, daily hassles? So that's the risk factors, but then what are the protective factors? What social supports are available through communities, school systems, parents, and so on. So then that helps determine how they react to those experiences. So that's the reactive coping methods. And so that support systems can help you have adaptive solutions or adaptive coping, which is how do you adapt to the specific situation? Is your coping skill appropriate to the level of the event that occurred, or is it maladaptive? So then number 4, stable coping responses are, what are your coping responses from childhood through adulthood? And then throughout the life course development, what are some of the outcomes? Is it more adverse or is it more productive? Next slide. And so researchers Anderson and Stevenson actually is creating therapy and coping for African-American parents and their children called the RECAST, Racial Encounter Coping Appraisal Socialization Theory. And so it's based on Lazarus and Folkman's stress appraisal model, but it's looking at it more from a racial perspective. So when a child comes to their parents and they think they may have been racially traumatized, the parent or authority figure can help them, appraise the situation, resolve the situation by making healthy decision making, and then enact specific coping skills that are specific to the situation and appropriate to the situation. And that's a form of racial socialization, which research has found helps Black youth become more resilient and garner healthier coping strategies when faced with, issues in school, racial trauma, and so on. And so within racial socialization, the main coping components are to instill cultural pride. So instead of having a deficit model on what's wrong with the community of color, talk about the strengths within their community and within their family systems. Also preparing Black youth for bias actually increased well-being and decreased depressive symptoms. So when Black parents actually discuss with their children, society may think less of you, but we have this cultural pride, then that actually increased well-being. And then having the adaptive coping. So not using the same coping strategies wherever you go, but adapting it specific to the situation. Next slide.
Okay, Emma, do you mind going to the next slide and then coming back to this one? Okay, so this slide is about building self-awareness, and this comes from a YouTube presentation that I watched with Dr. Christy Petty-Franchak and Miss Jordan, who does a lot of PD on racial equality in early childhood programs. And so this is their framework for discussion, because discussion can be very difficult around race. So this is the framework, and they call it community engagement. But I thought it was so powerful as a tool for self-reflection. It's something that in my preschool assessment clinic, there's a lot of people with a lot of personalities, and there are not a lot of minorities, and we feel that our voice is not heard a lot of times. So it was something I thought I could take into work at the beginning of next year so we can have an open, honest discussion. But the first one is to act with humility. So it's something that you should think about. You don't know the answers to everything. Not everyone knows the answers to, but to act with humility, I think, is beneficial in your practice. To take risks, to work as a community in the classroom. So that is with the students, that is with the teacher, that is you. You're all a community. Work from the growing edge. So things can be difficult, so not get complacent in the middle, but go to the edge. And if it's uncomfortable, that's okay. You grow from that. Be accountable for impact. And that is, again, something we struggle with at work. So where I work, people want to say that, they have a good heart. They didn't mean to. Their best friend is Black. That doesn't matter. What we're going to look at is, what did your actions do? We're going to look at impact and impact only. So we're not going to judge anyone's heart. We're just going to assume that everyone's has a kind heart, but look at what you wrote or what you said and look at the impact of that. Participate in restorative justice and, repair instead of being so punitive. Push beyond the binary thinking that there's only two ways and go to both and speak for yourself, the I feel, and it's okay to have lack of closure. So those are some things I think that can just, if you carry those thoughts into the next school year, can help. And then if you can go back. So if you can click that link, we just have some strategies. They're out there. I provided strategies for in the last slide, but the National Childhood Trauma Network does a really good job at talking to educators and families about working in the pandemic, some things to consider. If you can go up little. Questions to consider. You can read that for yourself. And the next one is even more comprehensive when you look at race. If you can go to the next one, Emma. So if you can go in it, you go.
It's not allowing me.
It's not allowing you.
Oh, there we go.
So if you can go up, 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 up. It has strategies for educators. What is important for educators to know, and it goes by age group. So are there any questions that we can address?
So what I will do, these are the references, logistics. I will send all of these out as a PDF so that you have them. I saw some people were furiously taking notes, but I will also send those out, as well as the resources that were covered in this. I'm now going to stop sharing our screen and go back to full view with everyone. And you're welcome to jump on the call now. What I will do is we're going to open it up for questions. Before we do that, and I unmute everybody, just so you know, next Wednesday at this same exact time, we're going to go deeper into the strategies of what this will look like when you're actually in the classroom. So it would be beneficial for you to read over the resources that Charlotte just showed quickly on the screen, just so you have more background knowledge. And then we have two other presenters, Alicia Ruby from In Harmony Therapeutic Services and someone from World Peace Teachings. They're going to go into the in-depth versions of what this will look like and how you can take this knowledge and better implement it for youth, whether you're an educator, a teaching artist, an administrator. So what you can be accountable for yourself, and then how you can better impact the youth that you're working with. So we will go more in depth of those strategies and tips next week as well. Again, I will record and send that out, but I invite you to join. So at this time, I'm going to unmute.
One thing I wanted to add regarding the coping strategies. One thing I wanted to add regarding coping strategies is that sometimes, more so seen with Black youth, there's a study in Chicago, Urban Prep High School. It showed that more avoidant strategies, like if they were exposed to gun violence in their communities, actually was more helpful. And so that's actually counterintuitive to the dominant culture of being more approach coping focused. Because if you're in a violent neighborhood, you're not going to approach the person shooting and tell them to stop shooting. So you have to build up that coping strategy to be a little more avoidant in order to keep yourself safe. So then when you come in the classroom, you may bring that same coping skill because you haven't adapted it to the different environments. So coping among children of color may look different, and it may not go according to the narrative of the dominant culture, but it's what works for them given their environment. So just really being mindful to that, like just because you coped in a certain way doesn't mean it's helpful for everyone else, especially people in, very threatening circumstances, or just with racial issues in general. You know how they say, oh, I don't understand why people have to riot and be angry and so on. But if you've been oppressed for centuries, that anger, of course, is gonna boil over. And that's what you see in that hypervigilance in PTSD. And so that's the generational racial trauma that you see even with Native Americans. There's multiple studies on Native Americans and generational trauma, which would be great for everyone to read. And so that's how coping looks when you've been oppressed for so long. So just keep that in mind.
All right, if you have a question, would like to use chat, unmute yourself, do it live. Either way is fine. But we'll open it up for any specific questions, thoughts, success stories, challenges that you've had in your own work that our wonderful speakers could help to answer.
I have a question.
Go for it.
Hey, this one's for Erica. Well, just all the information that I was just processing today, it was like, wow, because like I have everything. And it was just very, very intriguing just to be able to, you know, identify and put it to words. But you mentioned that for a lot of, you know, people of color who are like come from violent neighborhoods and, you know, have all these that they like there was the racial part from the Philadelphia study that from being years and years that is then passed down racially. And I was curious, like that's what happens to the oppressed. Is there a study, or is it like my brain is just flipping? Is that the same for those who have been the oppressors for years as well?
Oh, well, I can't say about their physiological symptoms, but of course that narrative is ingrained in them. That's why it's those unconscious biases where they automatically think a Black person is less than a white person. So if you look up, her name is Banaji, B-A-N-A-J-I, at Harvard. She does this implicit association test. And like it'll flash pictures of people of different races, ethnicities, and it's a certain theme, and you have to choose which one you think is like the violent person or the aggressor. And it shows even there's internalized oppression, of course. So, of course, if there's internalized oppression amongst people of color where they don't even want to choose their own people, then, of course, the white dominant culture who always thought they were better, they're going to have that ingrained as well. I don't think it would have negative health impacts, but, of course, you've heard of white fragility. So you can see that play out in that type of way because it's so embedded in how they breathe, you know? So it's like, that's why they have those unconscious bias trainings to be made aware of it, to be more mindful, because it's so ingrained that you don't even think about it. But it's interesting you bring up the facts about the actual oppressor. I wonder if there is any physiological studies. That would be interesting. But thank you.
Can you state the name? I heard it was Harvard, but can you state the name one more time of the individual for that study?
The last name, Banaji, B as in boy, A, N as in Nancy, A, J, I. And it's called the IAT, the Implicit Association Test.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for your question, Kaleem. Anyone else have thoughts, questions? Let me check my chat box.
I have not so much. I've been teaching a long time, and intuitively what I've done with my students is, how do I develop relationship? Not just, I'm not their friend, I'm their teacher, but how do they see me as a person? And they know that I see them as a person. The other is that what I've noticed, and I let me say, I'm an art teacher. I've taught in Cleveland for over 20 some years, from elementary through secondary. I've worked at settlement houses. I've been around, and the behaviors of my students generally are how they protect themselves. And by seeing that, that allows me to see them and not so much respond to their behaviors the way they want me to. In other words, generally I see my students trying to create situations, whether consciously or they're not aware of it, to show that they give evidence to prejudice, to give evidence that things are not going right, or to give themselves a back door so they don't have to deal with their own feelings. Much of the time they are doing things to keep themselves from feeling. And as their teacher, there are many times it's all about, can I give them a safe enough place that the things you talk about, risk taking, moving outside of what they think is comfortable, that's essentially what my curriculum is for my classes. I mean, we do art, but really and I'm not a therapist. I want to make this distinction. I may do things that may be therapeutic, but I do not pretend to be a therapist. I try to identify things that I can send students to where they could get help, or people who they would be more comfortable speaking with. It's this fine line. And in saying all that, what I'm most concerned about with this upcoming year is the layering of trauma. I'm already aware of the trauma many of my students come in with already, whether it's from the home, their sexual orientation, I can go on and on and on. Then now we're dealing with what's happening in the streets with Black Lives Matter, COVID, and then the additional stress of a whole new way in which, how are we supposed to do this teaching and how are they supposed to do this learning? And it bothers me in listening to other teachers in other Zoom meetings for other things, where I can't believe I'm hearing the students must be made accountable. In other words, they look at making the students wrong versus right now, all I can see is that if I'm doing anything as an art teacher, as a teacher, is, am I an appropriate adult that they could be comfortable with and be safe with, or at least know that for a little bit they're okay? And I'm looking at what can I do. I mean, I'm going to look over the written material. I know I'm talking too much, but I really need to sit down and get coursework. I really need training, because I really don't want to come in kind of knowing I don't want to come in having some buzzwords or having some knowledge and really screw these kids up more than they need to be. Okay, and that's not my job. My job is to keep them safe. Where do I go?
So Alan, I would certainly invite you to come next week, so that as we're going to go into these deep strategies for what this looks like, we're going to specifically talk about what it looks like virtually and what it looks like in person. Because I think the stressors on both of those are going to be additives to the layers you were speaking about. Having the privacy of having your friends or your classmates look in on your home, that's an added layer on top of all of these other things. Or having to wear a mask for 6 hours of your day is an added layer of stress. So we are going to touch upon that next week. And World Peace Teachings has done extensive research in that type of work. They are in CMSD often, and hopefully we can go in depth with that. But what I have heard multiple times from speaking with them and other therapists in art therapy specifically is you never get it right. And so adding, we also need to be aware that we are going through this trauma too, and how can we be aware of that, not let that add on to our stress, but also give ourselves some grace in understanding that things may happen, but the fact that you show up and you're there is kind of the baseline of what we can be as teachers and artists, and allowing them, the fact that you get to do the art with them, allowing them to use that as a coping mechanism, as an outlet to explain or be vulnerable in a way that they might not in their science or their other academic classrooms. But definitely come next week if you can. If not, we will be recording it and sending it out. Charlotte, you're muted. You have to unmute yourself.
So just maybe a couple of strategies that might help. I think to have a genuine empathetic relationship. It's relationship. Children know if you're genuine or not. Even the smallest one, the preschoolers know if you're genuine or not. And also, this is a tip that we think curriculum, but I have a friend who's a counselor who did some subbing. She said they need a buy-in. They need to have a buy-in to what you're doing. So does your art projects connect to their lives? Does it connect? Is it related? Or is it something that's somewhere off, like, I'm not interested. It doesn't connect to me. So having something that connects where you can demonstrate a genuine and empathetic relationship, I think will always be helpful.
Charlotte, you reminded me, it's not been fully released, but the Ohio Department of Education has just come up with a new drafted standards for fine arts. And they have perceiving, knowing, understanding. They have now added in their new draft for 2020, connecting, which I think is pretty huge for them to recognize that. Again, it's in draft form. It's not been released, but it's already up on the website if you would like to look at those. They've pared down the perceiving, knowing, and understanding, but they've added connectedness, which I think is huge to come out of ODE. So just a thought for everybody to also go and research those.
And I would add to remember the racial socialization, because that process actually is in newly created like guidebooks for parents of color in talking with their children about preparing to be in society as a person of color. And so emphasizing that they have those emotions, so acknowledging what's going on and building pride. So there's actually like a training that's done, even though this is more so for psychotherapy, but they use the racial socialization model. So in it, for building cultural pride, I would kind of steer away from family trees because not everyone has a traditional family. So maybe building some type of social network diagram and asking like, oh, in your social network, based like within your culture, what instills a sense of pride for you? What are some of the traditions? Who has provided you with their values? So building a sense of pride about their backgrounds. So a lot of activities around that without ignoring that there are negative emotions. So both go hand in hand. And so that's a problem I see with positive psychology sometimes. They don't want to acknowledge the dark side, but there is a dark side. So you have to address both.
All right, we have just a couple minutes. I want to make sure if anybody else had other questions, thoughts, success stories they would like to share. Check my chat. Don't see any raised hands. Okay, so I want to first thank Charlotte and Erica for their time today presenting this information. We know this is just 1 hour and that you could go into university PhD degree level in this type of work. We just wanted to kind of start the conversation within the arts and within arts education, as that's what Cal does, that's what the artists that I work with do. But I encourage everybody to look at the resources. I will send them out via email as well as this recording. I will send the slides, and then I will resend the Zoom invite for next week. That will be with World Peace Teachings and In Harmony Therapeutic Services for a deep dive into strategies and some tips and techniques that hopefully we can learn from a therapist of how we can employ, knowing we're not therapists in the classroom, but that we're doing trauma-informed care in the classroom, because we will all be there. As we said in our panel discussion 2 weeks ago, we know that students, especially in Northeast Ohio or in CMSD, the majority of them are coming to us with trauma. We can now say when school starts, 100% of them are going to come with trauma. And that's a hard cookie to digest. So the network is here. Please reach out if you have any further questions. The email that goes directly to me, I can forward other questions out to our network, the presenters from last week's panel, Erica or Charlotte, or next week's presenters as well. So we're here as one group to provide amazing art experiences and educational experiences for our youth, and we understand it's going to be a challenge next year. So thank you to those of you who joined the call today, and I look forward to seeing you all again next week. Bye, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.